The snow wasn't falling anymore. It was burying the world alive. In the frozen mountains of Caldenwood, in the winter of 1367, Ren Ashwood carried 7 wounded wolf pups for 3 days through the worst blizzard in living memory, with no idea that the smallest and most fragile of them, the one barely breathing in her arms, wasn't a pup at all. He was the Alpha King himself, hidden inside a body too small to betray who he really was. Winter came early that year, sinking its claws into the Caldenwood Mountains weeks before anyone was ready. The snow didn't drift down. It collapsed in thick, blinding sheets that swallowed the horizon whole and turned the ancient pines into pale, silent ghosts. For most of the valley, this was the season to bolt the doors and pray the firewood would last until spring. For Ren Ashwood, it was simply one more winter to survive alone, the way she had for the last 5 years. She lived in a stone and timber cabin cut into the western slope, far enough from the village of Halloway that no one had to remember she existed, and close enough that, in true desperation, someone would still climb the mountain path at midnight, begging for medicine. At 26, Ren had already been shamed and cast out by the very people who now, quietly, depended on her hands whenever a fever ran too hot or a birth went wrong. 5 winters earlier, she had found a gray wolf caught in an iron trap, bleeding out on the banks of the Halloway River. She'd saved him, packed the crushed leg with herbs, and let him go. A month later, the village council branded her a witch. No wolf lets a woman touch it and live, they said, unless dark magic was involved. They scorched her door with a torch and drove her out that same night. No trial, no chance to speak. Ren never argued. There was no point arguing with other people's fear. She gathered her herb books, her skinning knife, and the little she owned, and walked up the mountain until she found the abandoned cabin. There, away from anyone's judgment, she rebuilt a life curing the animals nobody else wanted to save. That Tuesday, the wind howled with a different kind of fury. It wasn't just cold, it was violent, as though the mountain itself were trying to tear something loose from inside it. Ren was hammering the last shutter into place when she heard the sound. It wasn't an ordinary howl. It was high, broken, a chorus of small cries tangled in the wind, as though it came from several tiny throats at once, and beneath it, barely audible, a growl too deep to belong to any pup. It was coming from the ravine, a narrow gorge choked with ice less than half an hour's walk away, where the local wolves sheltered during the worst storms. It wasn't her business. She knew that. She knew that stepping into that blizzard was as good as signing her own death warrant. But the sound kept going, weaker by the minute, and there was something in that chorus she recognized instantly. Creatures dying. Ren dropped the hammer, pulled on 2 layers of bearskin, grabbed her medicine satchel, a length of rope, and her knife, and walked straight into the storm. The trek to the ravine was a white hell. The wind cut like a blade through the firs, and the snow fell so thick she could barely see her own feet. When she finally reached the edge of the gorge, what she found turned her stomach. 7 wolf pups lay scattered across the ice-slick rocks, some buried to their necks in snow, others shivering inside a shallow crack in the stone. There was no mother in sight, no adult wolf anywhere, just 7 small bodies fighting the cold alone. Ren picked her way down the slippery slope, clutching frozen roots for balance, and as she got closer, she saw the reason for the desperate cries. One of them, the smallest of all, barely moved. Its breathing was shallow, almost gone, and a dark stain of blood spread beneath it. Coming from a wound too deep to have come from claws or rock, it looked like blade work, or worse, an arrow tipped in purified silver, its faint metallic shimmer still burning against the dark fur. She didn't think twice. She tucked the wounded pup inside her own cloak, against her chest, then gathered the other 6, binding them to her body with strips of leather. They growled weakly at first, but the frost had already drained whatever fight remained in them. Within minutes, all 7 were pressed against her as though she were the last source of warmth left in the world. Because in that moment, she was. The walk back should have taken half an hour. It took nearly 4. The storm had grown worse, erasing every trace of the trail, and Ren moved on instinct alone, counting each familiar tree like a lifeline. Her arms trembled under the weight of 7 bodies. Her feet had long stopped feeling the ground, and with every step she whispered to herself, "One more, just one more." By the time she shoved the cabin door open and collapsed by the hearth, night had fully fallen. She barely lit the fire before her hands stopped answering her. That first night was where the real trial began. The 6 larger pups recovered fast, warmed by the fire and fed goat's milk heated over the stove. But the smallest one stayed bad. The wound along his side was too deep, and the flesh around it smoked faintly, as if something inside the cut were burning from within. Ren cleaned it with herb alcohol, pulled a tiny fragment of silver lodged near a rib, and stitched the gash with boiled gut thread. Around the 3rd hour past midnight, the pup opened his eyes. They weren't the amber or yellow eyes common to wolves in that region. They were a deep, impossible sapphire blue, glinting with an intelligence that had no business existing in an animal so wounded. He stared at her for a long moment, as though weighing exactly who she was despite the pain, and Ren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. Then, exhausted, he closed his eyes again and fell asleep with his muzzle pressed into her palm. For the next 2 days, Ren didn't rest. The storm outside showed no sign of breaking, and inside the cabin she had to feed, warm, and treat 7 pups at once, rationing her food and firewood down to nothing. She slept sitting up, always with the smallest one curled against her chest, because it was the only way to keep him breathing. On the 2nd day, the little one's fever spiked and dipped in strange, erratic waves, and more than once, deep in the night, Ren could have sworn she felt the weight in her arms shift, as though the small body grew heavier for a moment, before shrinking back down. She told herself it was exhaustion. There was no other explanation that made sense, or so she tried to believe. On the 3rd day, just before dawn, someone pounded on the door hard enough to shake the frame. Ren was on her feet in an instant, knife in hand. Outside, half buried in snow, stood a massive man in the remains of reinforced leather armor, a deep wound bleeding through his shoulder, his face carved with exhaustion. Behind him, the snow was streaked red where he'd dragged himself up the mountain. The pups didn't growl at the stranger. They stirred, whining toward the smallest one, still wrapped in her cloak by the fire, as though waiting for something. "Where is he, woman?" the man rasped, his eyes sweeping the cabin with desperation. The smallest. The wounded one. "Is he alive?" "Who?" Ren said, her voice steadier than she felt, her body blocking the doorway. "There are only wolves here." The man, barely able to stand, let out a tired, bitter laugh. "Those aren't ordinary wolves, healer. And if he's alive, you've just saved the king of Caldenwood." Before Ren could answer, the smallest pup began convulsing violently by the fire. His small body arched and twisted, fur receding into skin in visible waves, bones rearranging with cracks that made Ren cover her mouth. What happened next defied everything she thought she understood about the world. The body grew, and kept growing, until where a pup the size of a house cat had lain, there now knelt a massive man, naked, steam rising off his skin, shoulders built like a warrior forged over decades of battle, black hair plastered to his forehead, the same wound now a deep, blackened gash across a muscled torso, still smoking with silver poison. He lifted his face slowly, and the same sapphire eyes that had studied her the night before locked onto her with an intensity that made her back into the wall. "My king," the wounded man whispered from the doorway, dropping to his knees with whatever strength he had left. Ren let the knife slip from her hand. "Impossible," she murmured. "I healed a pup." "You healed Alpha King Ronin Blackthorne," the soldier said, introducing himself with his last breath. "General Bram, commander of his guard. We were ambushed 4 nights ago by assassins sent by his own brother. A purified silver arrow nearly killed him. The only magic strong enough to save him was an old spell. one that shrank him into the weakest, smallest form possible, hiding him among the pups of 6 of my finest men, in hope that if we fell, he alone might survive, unseen. Ronin, still on his knees, breathed hard, but his eyes never left Ren. "You carried me for 3 days," he said, his voice a low, pained growl. "Through the wind, through the cold, with no idea who I was. Why?" "Because you were dying," Ren answered, her own voice trembling between fear and something she didn't yet have a name for. "I didn't ask who. I just saw someone who needed help." A heavy silence settled over the cabin, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the labored breathing of 2 wounded men. The other 6 pups, Ren realized, were trembling differently now too, and one by one, in smaller, gentler transformations, revealed themselves as children, sons of Bram's warriors, hidden alongside the king in the same desperate hope. "Who is the brother who did this?" Ren asked, kneeling beside Ronin, her healer's instincts taking over, hands already probing the blackened wound. "Cassius," Ronin said through gritted teeth as she touched the skin around the gash. "My half-brother. He's always believed the throne should be his. Born first, even though his mother was a second wife with no claim to succession. He hired human hunters, men who know how to forge purified silver strong enough to kill one of us. If I hadn't hidden, I'd be dead now, and Caldenwood's throne would be his." "This wound still has poison in it," Ren said, her fingers finding a second silver fragment lodged deeper than the first. "It needs to come out now, or you lose the arm, maybe your life." "Do what you have to," Ronin said, his eyes never leaving her face even as she prepared the boiled knife for the extraction. "I trust you more than I've trusted any physician at court." "You don't even know me," Ren whispered, hesitating for a moment. "I know enough," he answered, a fierce intensity crossing his gaze despite the pain. "You carried 7 starving, wounded bodies through a storm that would have killed most men I know. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. The extraction was brutal." Ronin didn't scream, but his fists clenched hard enough against the wooden floor to leave marks in the boards, and through it all his eyes stayed locked on hers, as if that alone kept him anchored through the pain. When the fragment finally came free, dark with blood and smoke, Ronin let out a low roar that rattled the cabin windows, then, exhausted, let his head fall against her shoulder. "You just saved my king twice in one night," Bram murmured from across the room, a mix of gratitude and awe in his voice. Over the following weeks, while the storm outside finally loosened its grip and Ronin slowly regained his strength, something shifted inside that small, isolated cabin. The Alpha King, used to commanding armies and sitting through war councils, found himself splitting firewood for Ren, learning to name the herbs in her winter garden, and watching her work with a fascination he made no effort to hide, because he didn't know how. "You don't treat people the way I expected a king to," Ren said one night, mending a tear in his cloak by the fire. "And how did you expect me to treat people?" Ronin asked, sitting closer than he needed to, as he always did now, with distance. "With the arrogance of someone who's never had to ask for anything," she said, not looking up from the stitching. Ronin went quiet for a moment. "I spent my whole life being treated as power, never as a person," he said finally. "You were the first in years to touch me without knowing who I was, and you still chose to save me. That's worth more than any bow I've ever received on a throne." Ren finally looked up, and what she found in his face stole her breath. Not the cold calculation of a king assessing a subject, but something rawer, more dangerous, closer to want. "You're my alpha now," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight she didn't yet understand. "Not by the law of my kingdom, but by something older, my own nature. The wolf in me knew you the moment it opened its eyes and saw you as a dying pup. You are my fated mate, Ren Ashby." "That's madness," she whispered, her heart hammering. "I'm an exiled healer. You're a king." "And I choose you anyway," Ronin said, moving closer, giving her every chance to pull away, which she didn't. "I would always choose you." The peace didn't last. The next morning, one of Bram's sons, keeping watch as he did every dawn, shouted a warning. "Riders, coming up the valley trail, flying Cassius's colors." Ronin, not yet fully healed, but with enough fury burning in his eyes to make up for it, rose and reached for the sword Ren had cleaned and sharpened during his recovery. "They must have followed our trail before the snow covered it," he said, tense. "At least 20 men. Bram's still too weak to fight beside me." Ren looked at the 7 lives huddled behind her in that cabin, the man she'd once carried as a dying pup, now standing as a wounded king in front of her, and felt something settle firmly into place. "Then we won't fight the way Cassius expects," she said. She knew that mountain better than any of Cassius's soldiers ever would. She spent the next hour rigging the ground with everything 5 years of exile had taught her. Crushed poison herbs scattered across the snow that burned and blinded on contact, ropes strung beneath thin frost, tied to metal bells that rang at the faintest disturbance, and a narrow, treacherous path she knew like her own hands, deadly to anyone who didn't. When the 20 riders arrived, advancing with easy confidence along what looked like an unguarded trail, the chaos Ren had built unfolded in seconds. Men dropped into snow-covered pits, ankles snapping. Others brushed the scattered herbs and began screaming, skin burning, vision blurring instantly. Ronin, wounded as he was, fought like a king with nothing left to lose, his sword cutting the air with a protective fury that made grown men flinch just looking at him. Ren didn't hide. She took up her hunting bow, firing with cold precision at anyone who got too close to the cabin, every arrow driven by the same resolve that had carried her through the storm with 7 dying pups. In the middle of the fight, a mercenary broke around the side of the cabin with a silver-tipped spear aimed straight at Ronin's exposed back, while he fought 2 men at once and never saw the threat closing in. Ren didn't hesitate. She threw herself between them, loosing her last arrow straight into the mercenary's throat, and he dropped feet away, the spear sliding harmless into the snow. Ronin spun around, eyes wide with horror at how close she'd come to dying for him, and something in his face shifted, the cold fury of battle giving way to something wilder, more desperate. "Never do that again," he roared, hauling her behind his own body with a protective arm, while finishing off the last man closing in. "You'd have done the same for me," she shouted back, breathless, fearless. The fight lasted less than 20 minutes, but it felt endless. By the end, of the 20 riders, most were too injured to continue, or had fled back down the mountain. None remained to carry word of defeat back to Cassius, except the silence of the mountain itself. When the silence returned, Ronin turned to Ren, the bow still trembling in her hands, and said nothing for a long moment. Then, in front of Bram, the children, and the whole mountain as witness, he knelt in the blood-stained snow before her. "You saved me as a dying pup, with no idea who I was," Ronin said, his voice carrying the weight of every word to the far edges of the valley. "You saved me again as a wounded man, knowing exactly the cost of it. And now you've just saved my life a 3rd time, with an arrow only a perfect huntress could have loosed. I don't know of any law, any throne, any tradition that could deny what my wolf already knew the first night. You are my Luna, Ren Ashby, if you'll have me." Ren looked around at the 7 lives she'd carried through the storm, all alive because of a decision she'd made without hesitation, on a night of blizzard. She looked at the king kneeling before her in the snow, the same man she'd once cradled to her chest, believing him nothing more than a dying pup. "I don't know the first thing about being a queen," she said finally, her voice breaking. "I don't need a queen who knows everything about crowns," Ronin answered, rising slowly and cupping her face in his calloused hands. "I need someone who carries my people through the storm without ever asking the cost. I've already found her. Weeks later, with the help of the loyal lords, Bram had rallied, and the truth of Cassius's betrayal finally laid bare. Ronin reclaimed his throne in Caldenwood without a single drop of innocent blood spilled inside his own walls. Cassius, captured trying to flee across the northern border, was brought before the council to answer for his crimes. But the reclaimed throne didn't bring Ren instant peace. On the third day inside the castle's stone walls, dressed in borrowed clothes that never quite fit right, she understood that surviving the snow had been, by far, the easiest part of this journey. The great hall was full when Lady Seraphine Voss entered, trailed by a retinue of servants and the rustle of a scarlet velvet gown worth more than Ren had seen in her entire life. Daughter of the most powerful lord in the southern territories, Seraphine had been promised to Ronin since the age of 12, an alliance sealed to unite the borderlands against raids from the north. Her beauty was the studied kind, every gesture calculated to look effortless, and her eyes, landing on Ren, held the precise coldness of someone who had already decided to hate before ever bothering to know her. "So this is the village healer," Seraphine said, her voice carrying across the entire hall, loud enough for every lord present to hear each word. "The one who smells of herbs and hearth smoke, and dares sit beside the throne of Caldenwood." "She saved my life 3 times, Ronin said, his voice low but sharp enough to silence the murmurs starting to ripple through the room. "And I was promised to you as a child, by a treaty that protects 2 entire houses," Seraphine shot back, stepping forward, chin raised. "Tell me, my king, what does this woman with no lineage, no army, no name, offer your people beyond bandages?" The hall held its breath. Ren felt the weight of dozens of noble eyes weighing her, measuring her, finding her wanting before she'd even opened her mouth. Ronin stepped forward, ready to answer for her, but Ren caught his arm gently and stopped him. "Let me answer," she said quietly, then turned to face Seraphine in front of the entire court. "I don't offer a treaty, Lady Seraphine," Ren said, her voice shaking only at first, before steadying. "I offer that on the night your king lay dying alone in a frozen ravine, bleeding silver poison from his side. It was my hands that carried him for 3 days, without knowing if he'd live to see the next dawn. I don't ask whether a man has land or armies when he's bleeding out on my table. I ask whether he'll survive the night. That's what I offered. And that's what I'll keep offering, every day, for the rest of his life." Seraphine went quiet for a moment, her eyes narrowing with fresh calculation. "Pretty words from a village healer," she finally said. "But words don't hold a kingdom together against Cassius's remaining allies in the south, the very lands my father controls. It was Bram, his arm still bound in a sling, who cut in, his voice carrying the authority of a general who had seen it all. With respect, Lady Seraphine, it was this same healer who brought down 7 of Cassius's mercenaries with a hunting bow while protecting your wounded king. I was there. She doesn't need an army, because she is one, when it counts." A different kind of murmur moved through the hall now, not contempt, but reconsideration. Still, one of the older lords, Count Harwick, raised his voice from the crowd. "My king, this isn't about courage. It's about blood and about law. A Luna without lunar lineage has never once been accepted by the pack in 300 years of Caldenwood history. How do you expect the warriors to follow her into war?" Ronin looked at Ren, silently asking if she wanted him to settle this by royal decree, ending the argument with the sheer force of his word. Ren shook her head slightly. That wasn't the kind of victory she needed. "Then let me prove it," she said, turning to Count Harwick and the whole hall. "Is there some ritual, some test the pack would recognize?" A heavy silence fell. It was Bram who finally answered, reluctant. "There's the trial of the healing blood. In the old days, before a Luna was crowned, she had to heal a warrior wounded beyond the reach of ordinary magic, proving her strength came from within, not from bloodline. No one's attempted it in generations." It's dangerous, often fatal for whoever tries. Then I'll try it, Ren said without hesitation. As it happened, cruelly or by some twist of fate too precise to be coincidence, one of Cassius's captured guards lay in a cell beneath the castle, gravely wounded by a blade poisoned with the same purified silver that had nearly killed Ronin, now dying too far gone for any ordinary cure. It was there Ren descended, watched by Seraphine, Count Harwick, and a dozen lords who followed only to witness her fail. For hours, under torchlight and the skeptical stares of the entire court, Ren worked over the dying prisoner's body, using every technique she'd learned in 5 years of exile, every herb she'd cataloged alone in the mountains, every trick she'd invented out of necessity when no one else was there to help her. Ronin stayed by her side the whole time, not as a king overseeing, but as a man watching. Pride and fear tangled together. The woman he loved risked everything in front of a court that only wanted to see her fail. When, just before dawn, the prisoner finally opened his eyes, breathing hard but alive, the dungeon fell into absolute silence. Ren, exhausted, her hands stained with blood and herbs, raised her eyes to Count Harwick. "Is that proof enough?" she asked, breathless. Harwick studied her for a long moment, then slowly lowered himself to one knee, a gesture that echoed through the dungeon like silent thunder. "That's proof enough, my queen," he said. Seraphine, watching from the doorway, said nothing, but when her eyes met Ren's, there was something there that wasn't pure contempt anymore, the bitter recognition of a fair defeat. She left Caldenwood 3 days later, without goodbyes, taking the Southern Alliance with her, but not the war so many had feared, because even the most skeptical lords had seen enough to choose peace. And on the morning Ronin was crowned once more before his entire people, he refused to sit the throne alone. Beside him, dressed not in imported noble silk, but in her own healer's clothes, now embroidered with the silver symbols of House Blackthorne, woven alongside the green sprigs that marked her own roots among the herbs and the mountain, stood Ren Ashwood, the woman an entire village had once driven out for witchcraft, whom an entire court had once doubted for lacking lineage, whom a powerful rival had once dismissed for having no name, was crowned Luna and Queen of Caldenwood, in front of warriors who now knelt not out of law or treaty, but because they had watched, with their own eyes, this woman heal the impossible twice. Once in the snow, saving a king she believed was nothing but a dying pup, and once in a dungeon, saving an enemy just to prove her strength, had never needed a crown to exist. When Ronin took her hand in front of the entire kingdom, the roar that rose from the hall wasn't one of obligation. It was loyalty, real and earned, the sound of an entire pack finally recognizing the woman who had carried their king through the storm and brought him home.